Hey fam, want to check out Roland Martin Unfiltered, the blackest show on all of digital, cable, and broadcast. Check out our audio podcast. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. It's Roland Martin Unfiltered. Press play. Congressman Holmes Norton, how you doing?
I'm doing well.
I'm going to start here. It's very interesting watching all these media reports as they talk about the students at Parkland in Florida. And folks go, oh my God, we've never seen this type of activism from students. And I'm sitting there going, have none of y'all ever heard of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee?
Speak.
I mean, it is, and I understand, you know, this level of student activism, they see it, but to say that really means that folks don't understand the role young people played in driving the civil rights movement or the black freedom movement, depending on who you talk to.
Roland, there is no successful movement, indeed revolution, that didn't start with very young people. Now, Rosa Parks sat in and you got the Montgomery bus boycott, but then there was a period when nothing happened until the sit-ins in 1960, and that is what really started the mass movement. The Montgomery bus boycott was extraordinarily important when you saw Southerners in Alabama take things into their own hands. But not until college students said, you must serve us, did a mass movement surround them, and as a result, we have the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1968 Fair Housing Act, all out of one very fertile period of activism that began with young people who, because they are young and foolish, will take risks that their parents could not possibly take.
And so when you talk about that being young and foolish, but it is that energy, it is that drive, as you said, for North Carolina A&T students. And even before that, Dr. Ron Walters was a high school student in Kansas and did a lunch counter sit-in when he was with the NAACP. And so I just get a kick out of these historically ignorant, news folks who somehow act as if these things didn't happen. And so when you think about those young folks, you were one of those folks. When you think about that period, when you think about the Freedom Riders, when you think about all of those different things, here were folks who said, we want a better future, a better life, and if we don't then step up and do it, no one else will.
Roland, as it turns out, it may be that our parents got used to a less than good life, but young people have not been used to that. They now have matured into that and essentially said, is this all? And they were willing to take the risk to change it. And that's what being young is all about. You take risks that maybe you don't have to pay for at the time. And that because you're young, you are almost entitled in a free society to take. And so as in SNCC, although there were risks, because you're young, you take risks that you're not fully knowledgeable about. You also don't have as much to lose. You haven't accumulated anything yet. You haven't become anything yet. In fact, it's because you are becoming, because you are forging your own identity, that you want to be a part of change. Your parents might want to be a part of change too, but they have a lot to lose. And so in a real sense, it's up to young people to take risks if they want a better life. And they take on that burden, and guess what? They get a better life as a result.
What was your decision-making process? So when did you say, all right, I'm ready to get involved, and what was the reaction from your parents?
Yeah, I remember when I was ready to get involved. Look, I was born and raised in the District of Columbia, segregated city, but a city with a real consciousness that even in elementary school, Negro History Week, we were taught how black people were treated. And because the District of Columbia was blacks in the District of Columbia were quite aspirational, that was passed on. I must tell you, by the time the sit-ins occurred, I said, what took us so long? And that may in part be the result of growing up in a segregated society with a social consciousness in the society. It really helped. Whereas you think about some of my peers from the South, they had to develop that consciousness. There was fear just to walk in the streets in some of those Southern communities.
You were how old?
Oh, I was in 20, I was in, when the civil rights movement broke out, I was in college, about to graduate. And so it then came to fruition when I was in college and law school.
And when all of us, obviously, SNCC, they meet at Shaw University. And then what's interesting about that, Y.T. Walker, Dr. King, according to Barbara Ransby's book, they were meeting with the university president trying to figure out how they could, in essence, co-opt SNCC or put it under SCLC. And Ella Baker hears about this meeting, wasn't invited, storms into the president's house and says, this is not going to happen. They will be completely independent. And I think that was so critical because SNCC was a student-run entity where young folks decided what we are going to do versus asking permission from adults.
This is so important, and Ella Baker, the revolutionary, that's how I think of her, understood that young people would be hampered if there was a takeover, even by the very brave civil rights movement, and they were very brave. Martin Luther King, SCLC, even the NAACP chapters took a lot of risk of their own lives. But they were very different risks. And it was very important, although not a lot of precedent, that the young people be able to go their own way. They already had shown that they could go their own way by the sit-in movement. When you initiate a movement of your own without your elders telling you to do so, what do you need them for? And so Ella Baker was chiefly responsible for saying to SNCC, hey, you don't have to worry. As long as you come together, nobody can stop you from forming your own organization.
What is interesting about, and I mean, first of all, she's somebody who very people really talk about, but when you talk about going from NAACP, going from, well, first of all, other progressive groups, NAACP, SCLC, SNCC, I mean, you had this one person who was a constant in all of these different groups, and so we hear all these other different names, and I just tell, and somebody who disagreed with King, who felt it was not pulpit to pew, it was pew to pulpit in terms of how you
Ella Baker was in so many ways ahead of her time. And the reason she was so restless is, frankly, she was one of the few women leaders in the civil rights movement. It was a very male-dominated movement that never let her rise to her full brilliance. And I use that word objectively, that's what she was. She was a brilliant activist. But as with the March on Washington, when the only person who didn't get to speak was Dorothy Height, there was the Big Seven, or whatever they called themselves.
Big Six.
Big Six.
But there was a women's pre-event. That was because Merle Evers Williams was supposed to speak, but then she had to go somewhere else. And I think
She didn't make it.
I think it was Daisy Bates who spoke. But it was like
Nobody
okay.
spoke.
Well, the pre-event.
Oh, yeah.
The pre-event.
The pre-event. So why do you need a pre-event? Why aren't you part of the main event? It's not as if it was a men's march.
Right.
But it does show you that even with Freedom Now, there was not yet the feminist movement. And black women, like white women and women the world over, were not treated equally even in the movement.
When you think about that period of time in terms of the level of activism, how could someone today, because I love it when people say, oh, that was so long ago, that stuff doesn't work today, and I'm going, you're nuts. But what should somebody today be studying about that period?
Roland, I have to tell you, there is no movement since the Civil Rights Movement that did not learn from the Civil Rights Movement. The women's rights movement virtually copied the Civil Rights Movement. Yes, their issues were very different, but look when the women's rights movement came, right on the tail of the Civil Rights Movement. And even today, when we look at what happened after President Trump was elected, what's the first thing that happened? Women got in the streets and marched. Never saw that happen before, except the first March on Washington, that 1963 March on Washington. There hadn't been a march in memory. And once people understood that if you want to affect the government, you have got to get into the streets, then that has been passed on. And now we're going to see the young people who are for gun control doing the very same thing.
Mobilized, then organized.
Then organized.
Now the one piece for me, as somebody who's born November 14th, 1968, so I always call myself a post-civil rights movement, okay, is that to me the most underappreciated aspect was the strategizing. Because I think so many people talk about, yes, the march, or they talk about the event or the news conference, but it was the brilliance of thinking through how do we go here or here, and then what's the next step, and then what's the next step, and then how do we link with this group and that group. King and others would send advance teams. SNCC sent advance teams into cities. SCLC did as well, learn the lay of the land, who's the people who's for us and against us. That to me is the most underappreciated, the strategizing.
The strategizing you're speaking about, Roland, appreciated that there was more than one organization in the civil rights movement, and they had to find ways to do their own thing and yet work together. And it also meant that you didn't just hop in. Here's the perfect example. The sit-ins began. The students didn't just have a meeting and saying, let's just go down there and sit in and see what the man does. They practiced sitting in, beating each other's heads, spitting on each other, so that when the time came that they would face that kind of animosity, they were ready for it.
That was training.
That was training themselves.
And so what happens today is very interesting when I'm giving speeches, when I'm talking to people. That to me is what a lot of people who want to do stuff don't talk about. It's the training part. Sure you can meet, sure you can come together, but if you don't train the people, I interviewed Dorothy Cotton, she talked about her role, in her book she talked about it, was breaking down the negative of what black folks had to go through, and then teaching them how then to be different. Training.
And when you say training, Roland, training and untraining, for those who lived in the Deep South, they were trained all right. Don't mess with the man. You take your life in your hands, who knows, somebody may be ticked off. And if so, you and your whole family may be in danger. That is no idle concern. During the Civil Rights Movement, many a family just had to vacate the South and go to Chicago because they had been trained how to be a black man or woman or even child in the old South. So now, how do you all of a sudden decide you're going to look the man in the eye?
Right.
You're not going to look down as you pass him by, and the last thing you're going to do is get into the gutter and let him go down. How do you do that? You saw your mama let him go by, and she's a woman. How do you do that? That's why it took a new generation.
Which is why when I meet young kids and when I shake their hand, and their mom and dad can be sitting right there, and they'll, oh, how you doing? I'm like, no, look me in the eye and tell me your name. And we've even seen it for African Americans in the workplace where you've had white bosses who would say, well, I'm not quite sure because when I was interviewing them, they wouldn't look me in the eye. Okay, but that didn't just happen. that goes back, and because you don't think about it, you don't realize that I don't necessarily look somebody in the eye. It's because of it was just natural, which may came from your parents or your grandparents or whatever. And it's so, to me, it's so much of that I don't think even a lot of African Americans realize how it is so deeply embedded in essence, some say the post-traumatic stress syndrome of just what we had to learn, and I think we're still unlearning that.
We're still unlearning that, which is why your notion of training parallels with untraining. If you've had a lifetime of training not to look a white man in the eye, which is the case even today, how do you get to the point where all of a sudden, if it's a teacher or if it's a grocery clerk, you didn't look him in the eye? How do you do that? You have to untrain yourself, and that is very difficult in a racist society. In a racist society where the power is still, the dominant power is still in the hands of white people.
In fact, it's so funny, I had a conversation the other day with a sister who is the assistant to the president of an organization. And the president is black, she's black. And her very nature is not to ruffle feathers among the whites within the organization. Even though there's only one person she reports to. She arguably is the second most powerful person in the organization. But her nature is, well, should I do this? Should I do that? What do you think they're gonna think? And her boss is going, it's only one other person who matters, me. And again, it's but when that's your disposition and when that's how you've had to operate in every other organization you've been in, it's a little hard to all of a sudden go, I'm gonna do this way. And they were telling me how there was a young white kid who came in and began to make demands like it was nothing, and who doesn't have the same level of power.
That young white kid wasn't taught to defer. It's one thing to defer to your elders, but there are not a lot of folks in the world you need to defer to. If you, quote, defer to your employer instead of looking him in the eye and telling him why he ought to hire you, that deference that you're giving him will result in your not being employed. He's looking to see if you have any get up and go. And if your get up and go is, and I won't say this, we don't use this anymore, get up, yes sir, Mr. Charlie, because that was when you that wasn't deference, that was obeisance. But if your deferral is perhaps too much respect, when he's looking to see what kind of gumption do you have, how will you handle people that you have to come in contact with in my name? Will you defer to them or will you take them on? Yeah, this is a generation, and perhaps the first generation, these millennials, may be the first generation that don't have to be untrained. Not sure, but that may be the case.
So I'm gonna say this, and I gotta get your reaction to it. So the last several years, I've given speeches, and I've talked about black folks being technically free. So I talked about 1619, 20 Africans coming, 244 years of slavery, 12 years of Reconstruction, almost 100 years of Jim Crow. King gets killed April 4, 68. Fair Housing Act gets passed. Nixon gets elected for Arthur Fletcher and affirmative action. And I said, so if you use 1970 as the marker, African Americans have only been technically fully free for 48 years. Then I said, now I don't have any kids, but I have 9 nieces and 4 nephews. So they're actually, to the point you just made, they're actually the first generation of African Americans born
Free.
Technically fully free.
Born free.
And when I say that on college campuses, the students go, they never think into, because slavery was so far away, oh, that Jim Crow stuff was so far away. It's like, no, but so with me born November 14, 1968, I wasn't born, and I use technically all the time, technically fully free. I was still born in a segregated America. This is the first generation born technically fully free.
That's an interesting point. And the reason I think that you are technically correct is the Civil Rights Acts were passed in the 1960s. So that by the time you get to 1970, you know, you have the Job Discrimination Act. You have blacks beginning to vote in the South. And finally, there is some housing remedy you can go when you're turned away. So in the 1960s, we're still living in Jim Crow America.
And you're still trying, and those acts are just being implemented.
Just being born.
Right.
And certainly just being implemented. By the 1970s, this implementation has begun. I mean, in 1977 is when I chaired the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Well, by that time, the commission had gotten a reputation for going after job discrimination. So it does show you the importance of 1970 on if you want to judge the generations to see if there has been any effect.
I'm gonna jump around. I gotta ask you, because we just mentioned housing, and so it jumped in me. I said I gotta ask you this here. What do you make of Secretary Ben Carson removing the anti-discrimination language from the mission statement of HUD? And earlier in the year, told cities that they canceled the Obama-era rule where they had to submit their plans to end segregated housing. And I'm going, this is the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, and a black Secretary of HUD is removing the anti-discrimination language from the mission of that department.
What greater insult to a generation that gave their lives, and I mean that quite literally, to get us to where we are today, than to see a throwback with somebody literally trying to erase the results of what they did with a stroke of his pen. This is one reason why this administration cannot last for long. Look, we've had Republican administrations. Not all of them has been as strongly civil rights as Obama, but I have never seen any president, any administration, until Trump and his black cohorts try to turn the clock back in writing so that nobody could make any mistake about it, not just in rhetoric, but here in regulations, here in what you have the power to do, and for what? What do you accomplish? Who are you pleasing? I don't even think Trump has asked for that. Very, very disappointing. So disappointing that I'm sure it won't last. I would reckon that if the next president is a Republican, he will be in reaction to this administration, and those regulations will go back to where they have been since the civil rights movement under presidents Republican and Democratic. That's just how much of a throwback that is. That's a throwback into the 20th century. We're deep into the 21st century now.
You've been to a ton of Black History Month events, MLK events, and I'm bothered by what I call Dr. King has become America's civil rights mascot. He's sort of like this bobblehead figure that we sort of bring out, and people say, oh my God, he was just so loving and loved everybody and wanted everybody to get along. And then you have House Speaker Paul Ryan and others, they issued their statements on how much they respected him and admired him. And I'm sitting there going, clearly, y'all have not actually read, listened, studied the radical revolutionary who Dr. King was.
Yeah, how often do they tell us that he was assassinated? Martin Luther King was such a revolutionary that he dared the society in every way in which he thought that they disrespected humanity. Remember, we're talking about what began as civil rights, but we're also talking about the Poor People's March. We're talking about the Vietnam War. And this is what made him a revolutionary. He didn't stick to his lane. Where he...
And black folks said, hey, you don't know anything about foreign policy. What are you doing?
It's his wide-ranging understanding of the interlocking relationships between the great issues of his times, made him into a truly great American. It's one of the reasons why, if you were to name, I don't know, let's say 3 great Americans of the 20th century, even if you included some presidents, I'm not sure who you would include, but Martin Luther King's name would be there. So understanding of him was King was of his times and what they demanded. And what they demanded is someone of revolutionary willing to take revolutionary risks. Because as you point out, when he spoke out on the Vietnam War, there were African Americans who essentially said, hey man, you were making headway on this oldest of American problems. Why don't you stay in that lane, maybe we'll get something accomplished.
And that was NAACP, it was Urban League, it was Carl Rowan. I mean, his approval numbers among black people was below 50%.
Oh.
Black people said, hey bro, you opposing America, you opposing, no, we're not with you on that one.
Yeah, you know, perhaps it was easy enough to raise our consciousness on what we were experiencing every day, that is racism, but not all of us were experiencing poverty every day, and certainly not all of us were going off into Vietnam to fight a war which the entire country has come to regret. Here was Martin Luther King on the cusp of that, telling them, this is not our war, we shouldn't be there. Now that, of course, is what a black man was not supposed to do. Talking about out of his lane, he was seen as out of his element, as you say, even by his brothers and sisters often. Black people who, like himself, were struggling to improve things for African Americans.
Did your paths cross?
Not really, you know, because I was a kid in the Civil Rights Movement, so they really didn't.
But in that period, watching what was going on, and then also now we know that last year of his life, how just difficult it was, how he was dealing with depression and was dealing with just so much pain and agony. I said to Clarence Jones, his attorney, I said, his death certificate was signed the day he gave the Riverside Church speech beyond Vietnam. I don't care. There is absolutely no coincidence that he is assassinated 1 year to the day he gave that speech.
You're not suggesting that Vietnam was the reason that this Southern white man shot him?
I believe that with Dr. King, when he began to deal with the money, when he began to talk about the military complex, that there was a fear of America that this black man was going beyond the South, was going beyond America, and was truly becoming a world moral leader. And that scared folks in America.
Martin Luther King, I believe, at least a year before he was assassinated, began to understand that he had gone so far that it would be almost impossible for him to escape danger, if not death. And so he began to talk about it. And up until the very end, when that last night at the Memphis meeting of garbage workers, when he said he was ready. That's the way Christians like that think about life. They want to be ready when the time comes. And I think he was preparing himself. And yes, when he branched out into the Vietnam War and met criticism, when the Poor People's March did not materialize in the way he thought it would, and even then people thought he was out of his element, he began to understand that he was accumulating enemies in what we then call the power structure from all over the country and all over the world. And here's why I believe that Martin Luther King probably died at peace, because he had prepared himself for death.
Describe for you April 4th, 1968. Where were you? What were you doing that day?
I'll never forget that day. I believe, I remember, I think I almost woke up to it, to learn of it. And as much as we had learned of his encounters with danger, I have to tell you, Roland, assassination I was not prepared for. I was young and married and just had my first child, and you know, for me, the civil rights movement would go on, or some version of it, forever. Yes, I knew King was in danger. And yes, Malcolm X had been assassinated. What I did not understand is that I was in the decade of assassinations, where when people disagreed with you, they would kill you.
Kennedy, Malcolm X, MLK, JFK, Medgar Evers.
Think about it. And
That's 5 in 5 years.
Of one decade. And what is not coincidental is that if you look at the decades of the 20th century, none was more robust in change, and in change that brought results. It was as if the country had a cataclysm, a lot of change, a lot of reaction.
People are going to gather in Memphis. They expect more than 50,000 to be there. People from all over the world are coming. Media are coming as well. And folks will commemorate, and they'll look back. What should be the focus April 5th, 2018?
And people have already begun. You speak about the Memphis remembrance. Shucks, 2 months ago, perhaps understanding the importance of this date. Garbage workers, I remember standing with them right here out in front of the Howard Theater. It was as if they were preparing for it. I think April 5th should be about making sure that Martin Luther King did not die in vain. That may sound like a cliche. Today, it doesn't sound like one to me when you talk about how the clock is being rolled back in some ways, even as we applaud how much progress has been made. But when we experienced an assassination that took away the greatest civil rights leader of our time, got to measure ourselves by whether or not we're willing to commit ourselves to continuing what he died for. Because he did die for it. No one can no one can doubt that Martin Luther King died for what he believed in and what he did. And there are very few of us for whom that can be said.
His book, his last book, which people, actually the one book that didn't, the least successful book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? And I've said repeatedly, I said, if you're black, that has to be on your shelf, because he literally made clear what we've been dealing with for 50 years. Claiborne Carson, the Stanford Institute, MK Institute. He said the civil rights movement in the 60s forced America, white America, to have to deal with democracy and diversity. He said, and we're still grappling with that. And King said in that book, he said, the biggest block to where we have to go will be our white allies. He said the moderate white and our white allies will not be with us. And when you think about after 8 years of Obama, and you look at a lot of folks who voted for Obama, who supported Trump, I still contend there is this fear of 2043 when we become a majority minority country. This fear of control, power. Okay, what do we do? Because we've been in control of this thing for so long. And that is what we are still fighting this. Yeah, look, hey, fine, y'all can vote, y'all can go into a hotel, but now you want to mess with the money. No, it's a whole different deal.
Well, it's still got the money, even as we become a black and brown country. It's going to take a lot to make equality stand up that way, but it is certainly true. And I think Trump supporters quintessentially stand for this. They're seeing the America of their fathers and grandfathers slip away from them. And the foremost evidence of that is, frankly, Barack Obama. And the reason it is because when you can elect a black president, even though it took a majority of whites to do that, it must mean that the country is turning as it is, black and brown. And where do you go from there? Are they afraid of being in the minority? I think so.
Oh, I agree. I think there's this whole deal of, okay, we don't know what to do. I mean, it's like, and it is happening. The fact that, and I think Time Magazine did a piece last year, in 7 or so states, the white death rate will surpass the annual white birth rate. And now all of a sudden, now you start going, wait a minute, now education and jobs and all of a sudden, okay, our kids now really got to compete.
Oh, we're way beyond below zero population growth. It's very interesting that the Speaker of the House said a couple of months ago, why aren't people having babies? It is true, we don't have enough people. To the extent that we're getting people, and by the way, black and brown people, as they move up, also have fewer children. So we need immigrants. We don't just need us to proliferate. And the more you get immigrants and the more you get black and brown people continuing to have children, the more some might see themselves as being miniaturized, becoming a minority, something that they have never been in their country. But why haven't they been? Think about where we are. We're so close to Latin America that if people could come and go, we would long ago have been a black and brown society. But of course, not until 1963 when they changed the immigration laws so that it doesn't simply prefer people of Western European background. That change in the immigration laws began to change America.
Because we're not far from, you said, Latin America, Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, West Indies, Caribbean.
This was meant to be a black and brown part of the world, but for 200 years, maybe 300 years, it was the white part of the world, and that is changing, and it was inevitable that it would change. And for people who have regard their own lives as coming from their whiteness, this is a problem. I got news for them. It didn't come from your whiteness. It came from the fact that you too were immigrants and you were treated fairly when you came to this country. That's all it's about. Yeah, there's going to be some competition there. There's going to be some black and brown people to compete with.
2 questions left. You said when you talked about when you ran the EEOC, I really try to get people to understand, even with the laws being changed in the 60s, there was massive resistance to freedom for black folks. And that's why I keep using technically fully free, because we still, King talked about we want our birthright. He rarely talked about equality. He talked about freedom, meaning, no, we want the same thing y'all got without having to pass any new laws, without any new stuff. But when you start thinking about the lawsuits and the blocking, and it was like, and so even after 70 on, it was like a fight for everything. You still had the housing suits and the job suits and the education suits. I don't think a lot of people really understand that the battle that existed post Black Freedom Movement.
Well, every inch of ground you had to fight for. I'm not sure when the post-freedom movement came unless the 1970s. But in the 1960s, you don't even have a mass movement until 1960 with the sit-in movement. Of course, the buildup had been clear, or else you wouldn't have had the sit-in movement. I mean, that didn't fall from the sky either. That's why I go back to the Montgomery bus boycott movement, frankly, to Brown versus Board of Education, where people in the courts were fighting the great battle. But it is no coincidence that these civil rights movements came about at the same time that the freedom movement was in operation. And yes, the culmination of it was the 1963 March on Washington. And after the 1963 March on Washington, you do get the 64, 65, and 68 Act. The only thing that distinguishes the 68 Act is that it came after the assassination of Martin Luther King.
But they blocked it for 3 years.
They blocked it until the assassination.
And LBJ sends a letter the next day saying there's no greater way to honor MLK than to pass this, and it gets passed 8 days later. His blood.
Is that what it takes, you know?
But blood from Bloody Sunday, that's what led to the Voting Rights Act.
That is true.
I mean, so when you start looking at all of these different things in our history, black blood has been required to wake America up.
No movement without sacrifice. And whose sacrifice was it? African Americans and their allies.
You mentioned white feminism. I know I had two questions, but I got to ask you this one because it really jumped out. I gave a speech in Dallas, airport minority concession contract, and I saved white women for last. And I said, white women, y'all really got to thank black people for where you've been. And the Russo looked at me. So I talked about Title IX. And I said, you know, Title IX was not about sports. I said, Title IX was about opening the professional schools to women. I said, now, if none of y'all even know where Title IX comes from, I said, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I said, so without black people, I said, you don't have a proliferation of female doctors and lawyers and engineers and professors or whatever the heck. And then I threw in the American with Disabilities Act, 1996, Civil Rights Act. I said, you gay and lesbian and you down with same-sex marriage, thank black people, that 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause. When you think about all of those different laws have been passed. Black people fought for them and others benefited. So that means that we were forcing America to be the country it said it was on paper.
Yeah, black people taught America, they're still teaching this lesson. Nothing changes without a struggle. Even white women didn't get the vote until they chained themselves to the White House gates. They were privileged people. In fact, their husbands ran America, and still they had to chain themselves to get the vote. If that doesn't teach you that if you're not willing to struggle, you get nothing, then nothing will. Blacks, of course, learned that lesson first because they got absolutely nothing until they were willing to struggle for it. That struggle took place in the courts for the longest time. And when that didn't do it all, they recognized, well, Montgomery bus boycott, we got to just walk for it. And that's when they walked to work rather than ride the bus. Even the law alone, even the great changes in law could not do it. Nothing takes the place of activism, of struggle.
You don't have to be here.
Beware.
You don't have to be here. You could be in the Bahamas, you could be in Jamaica, you could be relaxing, you could be enjoying life. I mean, you've worked all these years.
I am enjoying life.
Right, but what I'm saying is, look, other people who, they're focused on retirement. Why do you still do this?
I think that being born into struggle, you don't know how to stop. I indicated that the district was segregated, and I'm a third-generation Washingtonian whose great-grandfather came here as a runaway slave. So I think of myself as having known no other life, and increasingly people don't just say, job well done, let me see what else I can do. Increasingly, it's like perpetual motion. If it's perpetual motion, just keep going until you get stopped. Haven't got stopped yet. Do have to run every 2 years, though, so could get stopped. Run like I don't want to get stopped.
A lot of people, they'll say she's a lawyer, she's a politician, she's been an activist. What do you want people who have no idea who you are? I phrase it this way. If a child in the District of Columbia is born 50 years from now and they're in a classroom and they're being taught and they come across Eleanor Holmes Norton, what do you want that child to know who you really were?
If I think about it, I would like that child to think of my life as a life of activism. I mean, here we're trying to get statehood. We're not probably going to get it in my lifetime. But I would like to think that young people would say that activism in many ways is the way to keep your life and your society moving forward. And I would like for them to say, well, maybe there's no segregation there, but there is a need for activism. Let me find what that need is and let me be a part of it.
Cool.
Go for it.
Congresswoman, I appreciate it.
Always a
Thanks so
pleasure,
much.
Roland. Always a pleasure.
You want to check out Roland Martin Unfiltered? YouTube.com/Roland S. Martin. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. It's Roland Martin Unfiltered. See that name right there? Roland Martin Unfiltered. Like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's YouTube.com/Roland S. Martin. And don't forget to turn on your notifications so when we go live, you'll know it. You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. As Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Our goal is to get 20,000 of our fans contributing $50 each for the whole year. You can make this possible. RolandMartinUnfiltered.com.